Okay, so the first question that I was asked was in Tokyo, is there like a community of American Idol fans, like people both online and kind of offline that are into Idol stuff? I think this is yes and no, I guess. So I mean, well, I guess that means yes. First, I'll say for me personally, when I was living in China and now my life in Tokyo, in China, I lived in a small town. I really did not interact with many non-Chinese, period. So, at that time, it was pretty much all Chinese. I interact with very few, let alone, just non-Chinese, period. So, let alone Americans. In Tokyo, especially because it's a much more cosmopolitan city than where I was living in China, there's definitely a lot more non-Japanese people living here. I would say that the bulk of the people that I interact with, both for eventing purposes, but also just for life, are Chinese, actually. That said, I have made friends with a group of, I'm not going to say American eventers, but I will say non-Chinese, non-Japanese, so kind of American and European. That's largely been through Love Live stuff. There's kind of a good kind of medium-sized community of people that are really into Love Live and really like going to Love Live events. And by going to events, meeting them regularly, there's been a nice community, especially through Hasano Sora. But if you want to say specifically an American kind of Idol fan community, not really. It's almost kind of an interesting question to be asked in the first place, because I think and I don't need to belabor this too much, but I think it kind of reflects the different sorts of experience, the different way in which different people come here. So the Chinese community here in Tokyo is very large and it's very cohesive. Depending on what city in America people are from, you may have this experience with various immigrant communities there and various diaspora communities that, I lived in New York for a while, and before that San Francisco, and in New York, for example, I mean, there's multiple Chinatowns now. You have Chinatown proper in Manhattan, you have Flushing, there's one in Brooklyn, you have all sorts of different communities, people who've been there for 4 generations, people who've been there for 1, and everything in between, exchange students, etc. And so, here you see that dynamic. There's a lot more people moving here to kind of to live, to make their life. Whereas with Americans, there are people who want to make their life here, but you have a lot more people kind of just passing through. People who, because of their interest in anime or in Japan, they come in, are exchange students, they come and study, they come and teach English for a few years, maybe get a software engineering job or something like that. But the community is not nearly as cohesive, which is all to say that there definitely are Americans, but I'm thinking about the non-Japanese, non-Chinese people that I primarily spend my time with, especially in a fan context. A lot of Singaporeans, a lot of Australians, a lot of Southeast Asians, and then in kind of the broader people who fly to Japan a lot for events, that sort of thing. Europeans, we do have some Americans, that sort of thing. But it really is a spread. If you want to say specifically an American community, not really. And I, partly that just might be my personality, that I wasn't really like, oh, I'm going to find my fellow Americans. But I also think it reflects the sort of people who tend to come here, why they tend to come here, that sort of thing. Okay, the second question, I'm not exactly sure what the focus of the question should be. So, I think there's kind of a couple related things that it could be about. So I'm going to answer what I think the asker wants. And if you actually wanted something different, let me know and I'll follow up. But I think there's kind of a couple things. One is basically I think the general theme is, what do you think about Osh, supporting someone, kind of this culture that doesn't exist in America in quite the same way that it exists here? And maybe how did I come to have that? So kind of what are my thoughts on Osh culture and how it relate, especially coming from a place where it's not quite the same. And then, maybe a little bit of my history. Hopefully that answers the question. It's interesting because I sometimes think that we are in peak Osh, which is to say, I think that there's, especially in Japan, the culture and the openness around kind of supporting idols and that sort of thing has really grown a lot. People spend a lot of money on it. People are much more open about it, which I think is a good thing, but I do think there's going to be a bit of a reaction. I think it's a little bit interesting to think about, because I think sometimes people paint the picture of, America doesn't have this culture and Japan does in too stark of terms, because America does have Osh culture. I mean, you can look at Taylor Swift fans, for example, Swifties, they even have a name, Beyonce fans, and other artists like Lady Gaga, and who've built, very engaged followings. Going back much further with stuff like the Grateful Dead, where people would quit their jobs and just follow them tour to tour summers and, for a very long time. That was a whole thing. So, and then if you kind of go between that, you had like kind of the golden age of boy bands in America with, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, and a bunch of others. And people were really into it. You can, look up videos of, screaming fans and whatnot. And it looks a lot like what K-pop fans. Now, I do think that the intensity in Asia is often higher, but I think maybe more importantly is it's more spread throughout the culture, which is to say that a lot of people here are familiar with kind of idols and idoldom, and especially these days, a lot of people all throughout culture, throughout society, are kind of engaging with idoldom. Instead of, I was young and Backstreet Boys and NSYNC were really big, it was kind of seen as like, oh, that thing for, middle school and high school girls. Like it was very segmented. And I mean, there's a lot to unpack about how, American culture treats women's interests and things like that. Whatever, we don't need to get into it. But the point is I think that there's a lot of reasons why, I think there's a lot of differences with the way in which people engage with the idols here as opposed to in America, but I just don't think it's like this unbridgeable gap. I think there's actually a lot of similarities. I think one of the most important things to underscore, I think there's two, but the first one is just people spend a lot of money on this stuff here. Now, if you've been to any live shows in America, you might say the tickets are very expensive. They are very expensive. And the tickets here for a lot of events are actually much cheaper than they are in America. For example, a Hasuna Sora Live, like the last one I went to, the tickets were 12,000 yen, which, well, especially at the current exchange rate, that's what, like $80 for what ended up being about a 4-hour show. It's a great deal. The difference, though, is that fans here spend way more on merch, way more. Basically, the entire event ecosystem for idols and kind of what I call seiyuu idols, which is in kind of the anime seiyuu performer sphere, is propped up by the fact that Japanese fans spend a lot on merch. This might be getting away from what the person was interested in knowing about, but I think it's still pretty interesting. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit more and then, maybe course correct. But what I want to say is that a big part of the kind of fan culture here is merch and physical media. That's another thing. Like people here buy Blu-rays, people here buy CDs. If you're the Anime Exploration Club, the Japanese Blu-rays, if you're familiar, are much more expensive than the releases that you get. If something gets an English language release, they are much, much, much cheaper than they are in Japan. For example, Ave Mujika, right? Anime Exploration Club, my guess is that there's a number of you who have watched this. If you haven't already, you should ask your Chinese friend in this club about the drama around this in China. It's quite fascinating if you don't know already. But that's kind of besides the point. What I want to say is that this was quite expensive. I believe this was $200 or so, whereas the equivalent release in the US would probably be like 60, 70. And this isn't even the most expensive. Some other shows will have, for one core of anime, there will be 6 Blu-rays, and each one will be about, let's see, $50, $60. So quite expensive. Well, anime fans talk a lot about, what makes a show successful, what makes a show profitable, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot to be said there. But the point is that people spend a lot, and it really keeps a lot of the ecosystem going. One second. Okay, but I do think the intent of the question was a bit more social, although I do think all these factors are really important because it's important to understand why this ecosystem can exist. I will also say there are just a lot of idols. There's a ton of anime idols, there's a ton of idols proper, there's a ton of underground idols, there's just idols galore, and there's fans to keep it afloat. And it's a super interesting ecosystem in that regard. On the social side, I think another part of it is that the way in which people are judged is pretty different here, I think. And I think my experience, at least in America, was that, if you're into idols and if you're into kind of anime idols, I can't say how it is now because A, I'm not a young person, and B, I've lived outside of America for almost a decade now. But this reflects, at least when I was growing up and maybe in college and kind of working and whatnot, that, you know, idols were viewed as inauthentic. They were viewed as artificial. And I think they were viewed as exploitative. And I think that the relationship that fans had with these idols was often viewed as, in some cases, as maybe unhealthy, this kind of unrequited, one-way, unhealthy obsession and love. And on the other hand, kind of exploitative and maybe almost misogynistic. So I think there was a lot of really negative associations with idoldom in America, at least when I was growing up. And I think things have changed a bit, especially with the popularity of K-pop. But even talking to friends who are in America, who follow K-pop, I think a lot of people are still navigating what they can and can't say and who they can and can't say it to. I think the trend here, and at least in my experience in China, is that people are much more comfortable with kind of idol as a concept. Like a person who gets up and sings and dances, and like there isn't as much of an obsession with like, did they write their own songs? Like, are they living the life? Like, everyone knows that the answer is no, and that's fine. And, there's still some navigation of, well, is it real? Is the way that they interact with do they really care about their fans? Do they really have an interest in the things they're interested in? People still do navigate with that, but I think there's less of an obsession with like, by being an idol fan, you are supporting an inherently exploitative industry. People just kind of are okay with that. And for me personally, I think getting into the space involves kind of coming to grips with that. Like, what is my space in this? Am I supporting something bad or good? Or, is it real? Is it fake? I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'm not going to get into this now. This is already way too long, but that's also kind of my thing. These videos end up getting long, and I'm making an English language video just for you, so you can forgive me for rambling a little bit. For me personally, I'll be quick about it. How did I get into it? For a long time, I did not really allow myself. I think like a lot of people, when I was young and NSYNC and Backstreet Boys, like, oh, that's for girls like it. And so I kind of hated it on principle, which is stupid and, very, middle school boy of me. As I grew up, I was really into kind of the era of K-pop like 15 years ago. So groups like Miss A, SNSD, AOA, 21, kind of era of K-pop I liked a lot. That kind of got me more comfortable with all of this stuff. Also, pretty quickly was like, actually, NSYNC and Backstreet Boys have a lot of amazing songs, amazing karaoke songs. There's just a lot of good music in that era, and kind of came to appreciate that. And then through being an anime fan for a long time, I was anti-idol anime, which I think is pretty common in the English language anime fandom. People just kind of against idol anime on principle. And then I kind of was like, wait a second, maybe idol anime is actually really good. And as I kind of got older and worked on challenging my own biases in life in general, but also particularly in the media that I consumed, like, wait a second, everyone talks about how bad idol anime is or how pointless or whatever, but like, is it? I should check it out for myself. And then I did, and now I've watched a boatload of idol anime, and I can tell you, it's not all great, but neither is all isekai anime great. But some idol anime is really fantastic, really, really good. I would say the show that really helped me turn the corner was a show called Shinepost. I still think it's a fantastic show, one core, highly recommend it. Watched that and I was like, holy shit, all the idol anime haters were wrong. At least they were wrong about this. Although I watched that as it came out and like no one watched it, so they weren't hating on that. After that, I watched The Idol Master and I was like, this is amazing. This fucking rules. Great music, great characters. I have a giant Takane Shijo. Here's Takane as well. And that's how I got into it. And then I watched a ton of idol anime. I'm a fan of a bunch of stuff. And then especially I started getting into Love Live. Then I kind of discovered the live portion of Love Live, and I was like, holy shit, this is amazing. That's one thing that's kind of interesting. That could be a whole other video, is how, in my experience, like the English language fandom approaches Love Live in particular. and how the Japanese and Chinese fandom do, in particular because, the focus of Love Live has changed a bit. And if you only focus on the anime, it feels like there's nothing in the franchise, but that's kind of the tip of the iceberg, and the lives and like the storytelling, for example, in Hatsune Sora. Okay, and then the third question was, does this type of activity, for Americans have a higher kind of barrier, more barriers, more of a barrier to entry? I think the answer is yes. It's kind of ironic in that I think it's never been easier. It's in a sense, I'll use Love Live because this is the one that I've thought about the most, but I think it applies to a lot of others. Love Live definitely spent a lot more time courting global fans in the past, but due to, especially post-corona, that's definitely less of the case than it used to be. But on the flip side, just with the nature of the industry and social media and whatnot, it really has never been easier, I think, to follow not just the anime content of Love Live, but the Seiyu content, the lives, all of the lives have live streams. The Seiyu events even have live streams. There's just a lot more access than there used to be, but you kind of have to put a little bit more of that initial effort in. And I think that that's kind of the main thing. I mean, it's also the case that Japan is much farther from America than it is from China, especially for people in Beijing, Shanghai, other kind of large cities. Flights to Japan are plentiful, they're cheap. Especially, I mean, we've talked to some people who got some flights from like Guangzhou to Osaka that were dirt cheap. So even students can kind of make it work if, a group come and they get really cheap accommodations. I do know some people in school or kind of, in grad school, for example, who are flying from America to Japan for events, but, it's definitely more expensive, more of a commitment. I mean, a lot of them are all on the credit card points churn, which if you don't know what that is, you can look it up. It's how a lot of people fly on the cheap credit card rewards and whatnot. But the point is, I think like that inherently makes it a bit harder. There's also a lot more competition. Like during the pandemic, a lot of people in the kind of English language space got into VTubers instead. So there's just a lot more other options. And I think that for fans that live in faraway places, there's options that are easier to follow. I also think that there's kind of that cultural barrier that I talked about earlier, where I think getting over some biases, getting over, kind of the perceived judgment from others can be a bit harder than if you come from a culture where these sorts of fandoms are, people might think you're weird, but they're not going to think that you're like an oppressor or something like that. So I do think it's a bit harder for Americans maybe to, like, there's a couple more humps that they got to get over. But that said, I would highly encourage people to check it out. Like if you're someone who's, like I used to be, thought, oh, like those weird idols or whatever, or, oh, I don't know, that anime is not very good or whatever, I highly encourage you to give things a second chance or give them a first chance in some cases. Like a lot of people haven't watched a single idol anime. This is what kind of used to be my hobby on Reddit. If people said, I hate idol anime, or like, it's kind of the, when I was growing up about music, people would say, I listen to everything except country and rap. That was the thing. People's music habits have changed a lot, but maybe people still say that. And online, people will say, someone recommend an anime, not idol anime. And often my first question would be, have you watched any idol anime? Like, what's a single idol anime you've watched? And they would say, I have not watched a single idol anime. So, but idols proper, there's a bunch of different groups. There's some incredibly talented performers. There's a lot of musical styles. There's a lot of incredible dancers, especially these days. I would say the level of choreography in Japanese idoldom is better than it's ever been. Still a different vibe than K-pop. If you just want like kind of the perfect razor edge, like idol experience, I think K-pop is superior in that regard. But if you want a bit more access, if you want something that's a bit more raw, if you want more of a sense of like their growth as idols, as performers, the Japanese idol space is really good for that. And if you're into anime, there's this whole kind of Seiyu idol sphere of people who are Seiyu, where there's tie-ins with anime. They also are singers and performers. It's super engaging. There's a lot of access. the connection with anime for me is extremely compelling. The storytelling component, the character component is very engaging, and there's a lot of incredible music, which feels fresh and different than, you know, K-pop. And I like K-pop. A good friend of mine has been feeding me a lot of newer K-pop, and there's been a lot of stuff that I really like. My point is just that, like, you know, it's it's not just like K-pop but worse. It has its own identity and its own kind of musical history, its own performance language, its own audio language, and it's just kind of its own thing. And it's like a really fun niche with a lot of variety, with a lot of things going on. And if you're an anime fan, honestly, just some fantastic anime. So that was very, very, very long. My wife, who's helping me take this video the entire time, was like, "Oh my God, why is this so long?" But you know, that's kind of my deal. If you have any more questions, send them along. Always happy to engage with people about this stuff.